programming that we've got going on. It's actually going to take place from now all the way through January 31st. So if you get a chance to go to each of our branches, as well as here with me, we have the World of Fantasy exhibit. I want to thank David Wolfson and Jennifer Brew and the Wood Studios for really bringing together all of that exhibit. So please enjoy the costumes, visit the branches, etc. We do have flyers, the blue flyers. If you haven't already got one, you'll probably see other folks have them out there. You can take one with you, and also look on the website to learn more about what's going on. We have lots of events. We welcome you today here for the what we're calling the Worlds of Fantasy Genre Speaker Series. We're talking about the genre of fantasy, and we're going to be looking at film and literature, etc. And I want to thank the Utah Humanities Council for the generous funding of this event, a grant for this. So I very much appreciate that. There is an evaluation form at the end of this. If you're interested in filling that out, the Humanities Council appreciates that very much if you can give them some feedback. So today we have Brandon Sanderson, and I wanted to start the speaker series today by introducing our facilitator and moderator for the series, whose name is Alf Seeger. And Alf is from the University of Utah, from the English department, and he is a gamer, he's a writer, he's a literary expert and an adjunct professor, or professor there, assistant professor. There we go. So I want to welcome Alf here, and he's going to talk a little bit about fantasy genre, and so enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Dora. All right, so welcome to the first of 4 Worlds of Fantasy events at the City Library. So yes, I'm Dr. Alf Seeger. I teach up at the U in the Department of English, and if enough of you ask for it, hopefully we can teach a class in specifically fantasy literature in the next couple of years, because that would be really great. So let the department know if that interests you. And so I'm an avid reader of fantasy. I'm a fantasy board game designer, and fantasy has been sort of my grammar since I ever started growing up. And so I'm really pleased and honored that Raven Wolfson would ask me to come here to present for these events. So thank you, Raven. Where are you, Raven? Okay, I trust that he's in the control booth or something like that, looking down. All right, well, I just had a few things I wanted to say about fantasy as a genre, and I'm not going to take very long, but I wanted to just sort of set the tone, not just for today, but the whole series of events that are coming up here. I find it deliciously transgressive, actually, that we're here today to celebrate the fantasy novel as a genre. Fantasy novels, which dedicate themselves to worlds that don't actually exist, should not themselves exist. Here's what I mean. The English language novel emerged roughly 300 years ago as a rejection of non-realistic modes of literary representation, like Arthurian quest romances, which were early fantasies. The novel's goal was to be faithful to the world as it actually is, as an undistorted mirror of reality. So, the idea of a fantasy novel would strike early readers of the novel as violating all rules of fair play. But fantasy has this odd habit of making new rules for itself. By the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, writers like William Morris and Lord Dunsany had revitalized fantasy by fleshing out imaginary, self-consistent, novel-length alternative worlds, rivaling the texture of our own. These texts form taproots that nourished a flourishing of later fantasy writers such as C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and today's esteemed speaker. But please give me just 2 minutes more to say a few things about why I think fantasy is so important before I introduce our guest properly. If the early novel aimed at mirror-like fidelity to reality, a reproduction of the world, fantasy literature aims not at imitation, but creation, world-building, myth-making. Put another way, fantasy refuses to let actuality have the last word on what counts as real. That's a potent prospect, and one that can also get us into a bit of trouble. I suspect that most of us here are lovers of fantasy literature and have at one time or another been accused of escapism, of being unwilling to face reality. But in his marvelous essay on fairy stories, J.R.R. Tolkien points out that there are actually 2 different types of escape. One is the flight of the deserter. The other is the escape of one unjustly imprisoned. A question Tolkien urges us to ask those who would reduce fantasy to mere escapism is, why are you so eager to play jailer? One reality I think we'd all like to escape is the sort of world that reasserted itself yesterday in the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary. Not by evading or distracting ourselves from such horrors, but by making it a habit to refuse to accept such horrors as simply how the world is. Works of epic fantasy help us not just escape from reality, but to reality, a new reality. To grow gardens in a wasteland, we need not just spades and watering cans, but soil revitalized by Galadriel's dust. In such potent enchantments, we encounter a healing vision of wonder, an alternative to the exertion of mundane will, or violence. In fantasy, our reference points for reality move beyond what is, and instead into a vision of what might be. Or, as Ursula K. Le Guin puts it, writers of fantasy try to, quote, restore the sense to regain the knowledge that there is somewhere else, anywhere else, where other people may live another kind of life. The literature of imagination, even when tragic, is reassuring, not necessarily in the sense of offering nostalgic comfort, but because it offers a world large enough to contain alternatives and therefore offers hope. Today's speaker, award-winning, best-selling author Brandon Sanderson, offers precisely that and more. Brandon is the author of more pages than anyone 10 times his age has any business writing. It would be deliciously insolent if it just weren't all so incredibly good. So, well, there you go. This is said by someone who's older than Brandon Sanderson, you can tell. Brandon Sanderson has hit the New York Times hardcover fiction bestseller list 6 times, twice hitting #1, dethroning Dan Brown and John Grisham from that coveted station in the process, which really rocks when you think about it. In 2007, Brandon was chosen to complete Robert Jordan's much-beloved Wheel of Time series, which he will conclude in January with the release of the final book, A Memory of Light. He's received more awards than I have time to mention here. I felt like I was completing an epic quest just by reviewing his entire list of accomplishments online. But let me mention just a few, including the fact that Brandon is the only author to make the shortlist for the David Gemmell Legend Award 6 times in 4 years. He's won the Romantic Times Reviewer's Choice Award for Best Epic Fantasy twice and has been nominated 3 other years. He was twice nominated for the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer. Brandon is the author of multiple book series, including the Alcatraz and Mistborn books. The first novel in his planned 10-novel epic fantasy series, and if you've seen the first one, it's this thick. In the Stormlight Archive, The Way of Kings reached #7 on the New York Times hardcover fiction bestseller list in 2010, and remained on the list for an additional 3 weeks. His works have been translated into over 20 languages, and he teaches creative writing at Brigham Young University. On a more personal note, I wanted to mention that students of mine who have met or worked with Brandon have remarked not only on his amazing ability, but also his personability, his willingness to take time to help them improve their own writing. Brandon will be hosting a Q&A session focused on world building, followed by a book signing a little later this afternoon. So I know we have a very exciting day ahead of us. We're privileged to have Brandon Sanderson speak to us today. Please welcome Brandon Sanderson.
Thank you. I was the art department. We don't stand at podiums, we move around. So I'm going to get rid of this. Hi. Thank you guys for coming. I am Brandon, and I'm very excited to be here because I don't get to wear my academic hat very often, right? I went to college wanting to be a writer. And somehow I ended up in the science department for my first year. This happened because my mother was convinced that writers don't make a living, right? That this wasn't something real. And this gets into what we're going to talk a little bit about today. The real world is the world of my mother. She's an accountant for the city of Idaho Falls. And it's a very stable job. She's never had to worry take down my volume because I talk too loud, sorry. And so, she convinced me that writing is not a real thing. Writing is a fantasy, being a writer for a living. And I ended up in the real world my freshman year, and it was kind of dreary and scary. And I'm glad we had chemists. I love chemistry. I love the concepts of all the sciences. I love reading them. That's how I ended up in those classes. But the reality of those classes was a whole lot of math. And that was really quite jarring for me when high school chemistry had been about blowing things up and making, you know, cool mixes that smoke. And so I decided I'm going to do this fantasy writer thing, and started writing. I've been writing since I was a teenager, but you know, no one really told me ever how you go about doing this, so I just started doing it. And you know, wrote 13 novels over the course of the next 10 years or whatever. And it turns out that my worlds that I wanted to become real could be real. And that's kind of the theme of speculative fiction as a whole. The unreal becoming real. You can define fantasy, and it has been defined this way. I'm going to pull up my notes here just a second. You can define fantasy in a lot of different ways. And part of what I would like to do today with you guys is I want to come up with a definition of fantasy together. That's why we have a whiteboard. I was doing this whole PowerPoint thing and stuff. I'm like, oh, this is going to be awesome. And then I realized I was like wearing my lecture university guy hat a little too much, and it was going to be really boring. So I decided I would trash all that, and we would go with this instead. The blank sheet. You know, the thing that faces me every day, and is my job to fill. Today we're going to fill it. So I'm actually going to write up here. I'm going to write up what is fantasy, and we're going to try and define it. You get to see my wonderful handwriting that I'm very proud of, and that my mother is ashamed by. By the way, we were looking through all of my little childhood things. I was looking with my mother last time I went up, and she was digging out all my report cards and things, and we got to look through all of mine from grade school, which all said things like, Brandon is wildly imaginative, but I just can't get him to do anything. You know, all those sorts of things. That you might imagine were the case for me, and we got my report cards, and we got a big laugh out of the fact that, you know, they gave S's and U's, satisfactory and unsatisfactory. That's all they would give in grade school, and it's like S, 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 U, handwriting. S, 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 next year, U, handwriting. And so I'm sure those teachers would be very proud of the fact that now I write for a living. Yes, oh the irony. So we're going to define fantasy. We're going to try and figure it out today. And I've got a few notes here on what I think fantasy might be. But this is like the big thing. It's kind of interesting. When I go to conventions and things, we talk about what is the fantasy genre, what is science fiction, what's the line between them and between other genres. And it gets really heated. We have lots of arguments about these things at conventions, and it's funny to me that the very thing we do, we have so much trouble defining. I want you guys to do it. I'm going to make you throw out and tell me, in your mind, what is fantasy? What are things that make a fantasy story into a fantasy story? That if you know, what's the calling card of a fantasy? All right, right here.
Magic.
Okay, magic. Okay. What else do we got? Yes?
Characters.
Characters. Okay, characters. Yeah, it says characters. What else? Okay, in the back.
Battle between good and evil.
Okay, good versus evil. All right, what else? What else? Myth. Okay, myth is a pretty good one. Right here.
There's usually elements of adventure.
Adventure. What else do we got right here?
Monsters.
Monsters. Ooh, monster. Boy, I'm used to the big whiteboards we have at the universities now, where I can like write all across. This is really small. So I may have to like go up the sides and things like that.
Secondary world.
Okay, secondary world. There we go. We're all fantasists, right? We We don't have to be linear. We don't have to, you know, work in 2 dimensions. We can work in 7.
Prophecy.
Prophecy. Oh boy, can I spell that? The problem is you know, that to prophecy and a prophecy are spelled differently, which always is really crazy. Okay, over here. Mystical creatures. Okay. Okay.
What if?
What if? Ooh. That's kind of cool. All right.
What if there unrealistic elements like things that defy physics and what we understand?
Okay, defying physics. So I'm going to sing that song from Wicked. Defy gravity. Okay.
There are battles.
Battles. Ooh, up here, battles. Okay. All right then.
Empowerment of the marginalized.
Empowerment of the marginalized. Wow, that sounds very academic. Are you a student at like the U or something? Maybe in the class? You're a teacher. Ooh. Empower the marginal. Wow, I totally missed that one. Look, that says marginalized. Like my spelling. All right, over here.
Cool items that do stuff.
Okay, yeah, we've got the MacGuffin, the mystical object.
Cool items that stuff.
Yes, mystic object. Okay, let's do like 2 more.
Surreal twist to realistic.
Okay, the surreal, the weird, right? Is that what you're getting at?
I'm like saying you take like a realistic event and then kind of change it a little bit.
Okay.
Something that's not quite believable is believable enough in that world.
All right, all right. 1 more. Who else wants to throw one out here? All right, right there.
The ability for one person to change the world.
Oh, okay. Okay, 1 person to change the world. Interestingly, on that note, when I pitched The Way of Kings to Tom Doherty in 2009. Tom Doherty's the founder and now still CEO of Tor Books. And, you know, I probably didn't need to pitch to him because I was his #1 author, but I still did. And this is because I really felt like I wanted to go in with a clear vision of this novel. The reason being, I tried to write Way of Kings in 2002, and it hadn't quite gone right. I hadn't been good enough to write it yet. I finished it, it was a monster, and it was off. And I went and I pitched it to Tom, and one of the things I brought out as a hallmark of what I think really strong epic fantasy does, and one of the reasons why we read it, this is a world where one person can still make a big difference. I think one person can make a difference in our world too, but sometimes it's hard for us to believe that, and we can make it work in the fantasy world. And so I like that you brought that one up, because that was one of the things that was a big center of my presentation to him. So we've got all this stuff here, and I like all this stuff. This is all very cool. The question I start to have though is, which of these things are absolutely essential? And that's kind of the thing that we start arguing about. Do you have to have a fight versus good and evil in a fantasy novel? If a book does not have that, do you say then it is not a fantasy? No. I mean, obviously the most popular fantasy novel series going right now, if you discount The Wheel of Time, it's probably The Song of Ice and Fire, which is not a good versus evil story. It's kind of a kind of evil versus kind of evil story. Right? So, good versus evil, while a major theme of a large amount of fantasy, particularly that kind of the Tolkien or Lewis schools, is good versus evil. It's not necessary to it being a fantasy novel. And so, you know, we start to ask which of these things are actually, can you have a fantasy novel without prophecy? Yes, you can. Can you have a fantasy novel without it's not the secondary world? It depends, I guess, on what you define, how you define the secondary world, but we could have a fantasy novel if a wizard showed up on the stage with me in a story. Is that a fantasy novel? lot of fantasies I like. In fact, a lot of early fantasy would not be technically secondary world by our definitions today. Well, what do you guys think was the first fantasy novel in your definitions? Or the first fantasy story, really? Like, where did fantasy begin?
Beowulf.
Beowulf? You're going to go with Beowulf? Okay, cool. What's that, Homer? Okay, you can go with Homer.
Cave
What's that, cave paintings? Okay, someone just went up to you by cave paintings. Let's just pick one of these. Let's look at the Greek myths, okay? Let's look at Homer, who is not really Greek myths, but is Greek epic and things like that. And let's kind of say, and see if we can tease out something that might make a definition for fantasy. Someone's telling a story about Hercules, all right? One of the 12 trials, or the 10 trials, or how many he did. He did lots, right? However many things he did. They're talking about him cutting off heads of a hydra. It's a pretty fantastical story. Is that a fantasy story? Yes or no? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands.
It depends on how you look at it.
Okay, all right. Let's have the no-sayers. Why would it not? How could it not be?
Well, I don't know a ton about Greek myth, but if you're telling it to people who that's part of their religion, for example, then that wouldn't be a fantasy to them. That would be something that's apart from the world, but it wouldn't be false.
Okay, okay. So, if you are a person that believes that the Hydra is a real thing, telling a bunch of people who believe that a Hydra is a real thing about a person that you think was real that killed a Hydra, is that a fantasy in the story?
Depends on which side of the book you're on.
Yeah. If you are telling a story about a guy who taught a lot of people and then died and came back to life, and you believe it really happened and everyone you're talking to believes it really happened, is that a fantasy story? This gets a little bit sketchy. And it's kind of interesting to define. And one of the problems is we're not really 100% sure what people believed back then. If we look at something like Homer, did Homer think he was telling a real story, or was he just, imagining something? If we look at Midsummer Night's Dream, this is a great example. Midsummer Night's Dream, by our definitions, is probably a fantasy. But the question, you go back there, is, did they believe that the fae folk were real? A lot of them seemed to. And so, a story about a person being taken captive by the fae folk, they're like, yeah, I hope that doesn't happen to me. That's a different type of story. Now, a lot of them maybe didn't. But it's really kind of come to our modern era before we can really prove these things. A lot of people, even in the 1800s, really believed in a lot of this stuff. They believed in all of this sort of mystical, they lived in a mystical world. And so telling stories about a mystical world to them was just talking about what could happen, what might have happened. Don't go in the woods because the monsters will eat you, and yes, they're real. Or is it don't go in the woods because monsters will eat you, and we don't believe they're really monsters, but something else will eat you, so don't go in there. This kind of delves into what is the fantasy genre, and I think it's really interesting because to me, the fantasy genre changes depending on your own belief in it. Right? This is really weird, okay? I mean, if you were using most definitions of genre, you could say, objectively, this is a poem, and this is prose, and there's really no arguments except for the weird stuff. And my job is to deal with different weird stuff, so you can go ask your English professors about that one. If you're going to say, what makes a story a mystery? You can objectively say, this is a mystery. But a fantasy story, you can't define unless you know your audience. The audience decides if it's fantasy or not. Just like you would decide in reading the Bible if the Bible is fantasy or not to you. Isn't that bizarre? Have you ever thought about that? How this is a genre that is defined by its readers. And I think it's unique. Speculative fiction is unique in that way.